There's a story about two elderly Jewish widowers who lived in Miami Beach, who would meet one another at a certain restaurant on Collins Avenue every morning promptly at 7 o'clock. One was named Max, and the other was named Velvel. One morning, Velvel said to Max, "You know, Max, we're getting on in years. One day, one of us will not show up. One of us will go first. So let's make a pact. Let's promise one another that whoever goes first will try to contact the other one from the next world to tell him what it's like in the world to come." And so about 10 months passed, and one day Max didn't show up for breakfast. Velvel waited and waited, and still no Max. So Velvel called Max on the telephone, no answer. Velvel got worried, so he took a cab to Max's apartment. He knocked on the door, no answer. So Velvel got the janitor to open the door, and there, Nebuch, was poor Max, dead. And so there was the funeral, and the Shiva, and the Shloshim, the mourning, and poor Velvel was lonely, but he forgot all about his pact with Max. One night, Velvel was fast asleep, and he awoke with a start. He thought he heard someone calling his name. Velvel, Velvel. It must be a noise from the street, he thought, so he went back to sleep. But again he was awakened, and this time the voice was louder. But no sooner had his head hit the pillow than the voice returned. And the voice seemed familiar. "Who is it? Who's that?" Velvel cried, reaching for his cane for protection. "Velvel," the voice said, "you think I have all the time in the world? It's me, it's Max." "Max, is it really you?" said Velvel. "Yes, Velvel, it's really me, it's Max. And I'm speaking to you from the next world. I've come back as we agreed to tell you what it's like here in the world to come." So Velvel says, "So new Max, tell me, what is it like?" And Max says, "Well, Velvel, it's just wonderful. In the morning, I can sleep as long as I want. After I get up, I can eat as much as I want. No diets, no pills, no worries about cholesterol or calories. I can eat as much as I want. Then I take a little nap to get some strength for the afternoon activity, which is sex, as much as I want and with whomever I want. And then I have a little snack and I go to sleep, and that's my day." So Velvel says, "So Max, this is what you do on Shabbos. This is what you do on Yontif, holidays. What do you do during the week?" Max says, "No, Velvel, you don't understand. Here we do this every day. Every day is a holiday. We eat as much as we want, sleep as much as we want, sex as much as we want, every single day." So Velvel says, "So Max, Mazel Tov, you made it into heaven. I hope I'll be so lucky." And Max says, "I'm not in heaven." "You mean you do all these things as much as you want every day and you're not in heaven? You don't mean to tell me that you're in the other place?" "No, Velvel," Max says, "I'm not in heaven and I'm not in the other place." So Velvel says, "So Max, if you're not in heaven and you're not in the other place, so then where are you?" And he says, "I'm here. I'm here in the good US of A. In fact, if you take a plane for 4 hours and a bus for 2 hours, you can come and visit me." Velvel says, "Max, I don't understand. You are in the next world, yes? Max says, yes, Volvo, I am in the next world. I am in the next life. As a matter of fact, I'm a buffalo living in Wyoming. Now, contrary to what many people believe, we do have an idea of reincarnation in Judaism, and it's an idea that was introduced into Judaism by the medieval mystics and became a very popular idea among the 19th century East European Hasidim. But in earlier Judaism, they had a simpler idea of life after death. A person dies, and he or she goes before the heavenly tribunal for a final Yom Hadin, for a final day of judgment. For example, in the Talmudic tractate Shabbat, it says, after a person dies and is brought for justice in the next world, each person is asked 4 questions. These are not the 4 questions of the Passover Seder. These are another set of 4 questions. And the 4 questions are, number 1, were you honest in your business dealings? Number 2, did you set aside time to study the Torah? 3, did you have children? And 4, did you hope for redemption? And I've always been startled by this Talmudic text, not only because of what these questions are, but because of what questions are not asked. We might expect the text to ask, did you observe the Sabbath? Did you make a Passover Seder? Did you keep the dietary laws? Did you go to the synagogue? Did you give to charity? But no, none of these questions are asked. And so I've always been puzzled why these 4 questions above all others, and why these questions are asked in the afterlife. And I think the answer is because they relate to our self-perpetuation beyond the grave, namely business dealings, the perpetuation of our honestly begotten wealth, study, the perpetuation of wisdom and experience, children, biological perpetuation, redemption, the perpetuation of our hopes and dreams. In other words, the concept of the afterlife deals with expectations in terms of our self-perpetuation. Or as Erik Erikson put it, I am what survives me. The challenge and the goal of life, as the great American philosopher William James put it, is to spend it for something that will outlast it. I would put it a little differently, to invest it for something that will outlast it. Indeed, many of us are preoccupied with our investments for retirement, but how many of us are preoccupied with our investments in what will outlast us? So what I want to focus in on this afternoon is how classical Jewish sources, from the Bible, through the Talmudic rabbis, through the medieval Jewish philosophers, legalists, and mystics, down to our own day, deal with the inevitable question. The inevitable question is, what's next? Self-perpetuation is largely determined by what and by how much one has invested in the ultimate future options exchange. Now, I would imagine that if we took a survey of most American Jews, perhaps even of most of you here, as to whether and what is the Jewish theological view of the afterlife, we might discover that the prevalent view is that Judaism has no concept of an existence after death. Most American Jews hold that view, that we don't have such a concept. But this would be an exercise in Jewish sociology, not in theology. For in fact, as we shall see, Judaism, that is Jewish theology, has a rich and a multifaceted idea in answer to the question of what's next. One often hears the popular view that Judaism is the religion of this world, and Christianity is a religion that focuses on the next world. But I doubt very much that either claim is true. And in this regard, consider this Hasidic story. In the Talmud, there is a statement, all members of the people of Israel have a portion in the world to come. The text continues to note exceptions to this rule and observes that the only Jews who do not have a portion in the world to come are those Jews who do not believe in the world to come. Now it is told that a Hasid once approached his master, confessing that he had problems dealing with this Talmudic text, all Jews have a portion in the world to come. The master said to his disciple, "Is your problem with the text that you have trouble believing in the existence of the world to come?" "No," said the Hasid. "My trouble is believing in this world, that this world is real." So it may surprise many of you to learn that this view, that the world to come is the real world, because it is eternal and spiritual, while our world cannot be considered the real world because it is transient and material, is a view that pervades much, if not most, of classical Jewish religious literature. Consider, for example, the well-known statement in the Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, that compares our world to a vestibule, to a waiting room, and the world to come to the great hall to which we seek entrance. This view, which affirms the greater significance of the next world over this world, is expressed by Jewish pietists, philosophers, legalists, and mystics alike. Consider, for example, that this view is dominant in the two most historically important works of medieval Jewish ethical literature, namely the Chovot HaLevavot, the Duties of the Heart, by the 11th century Jewish philosopher Bachi ibn Pakuda, and the Mesilat Yesharim, the Paths of the Upright, by the 18th century Jewish mystic Rabbi Moses Chaim Luzzatto. Here's what Luzzatto says, and I quote, "The purpose for which human beings have been created is realized not in this world, but in the world to come. Human existence in this world is but a preparation for existence in the next world, which is the goal." Bachia not only stresses the reality of the next world over this world, but maintains that the belief that there is no next world tends to lead to hedonism, to over-preoccupation with triviality, and to a lack of accepting moral responsibility. Hence, from what already has been said, we can see the following 5 ideas. 1. The idea of the afterlife in Judaism is deeply rooted in all aspects, periods, and genre of classical Jewish religious literature. And despite Jewish perceptions in contemporary America that want to deny a life to the idea of the afterlife is nonetheless one of the most fundamental cardinal beliefs of the Jewish religion, and has been affirmed by virtually every significant Jewish thinker from Talmudic to modern times. Not only do Maimonides and other thinkers list it amongst the principles of the Jewish faith, but it appears throughout the traditional Jewish liturgy and is reflected in many popular Jewish folk practices. For example, in the Amidah prayer, recited 3 times daily, God is blessed for faithfully reviving the soul, Michaye Hametim. And certainly, popularly observed traditions, such as the Yizkor or the Yahrzeit, would be meaningless without a belief in the afterlife. Second, despite a popular contemporary view that the idea of an afterlife leads to moral and social escapism, that is, the view that since this world is not the essential world, that we need not emphasize social and moral responsibility, Nonetheless, we see from Bachya's work that the opposite is true, namely that accountability in the future world demands moral and responsibility and social responsibility in this world. Indeed, Luzzatto's idea that we must concentrate on developing our spiritual, moral, and creative selves in this world so that we might prepare ourselves for the next world is very close to the observation made by the great British poet John Keats when he wrote, "The world is a vale of soul making." Thirdly, consider the analogy of the soul and the body to an astronaut. In space, the astronaut is totally dependent upon his spacesuit for existence in space. But it is not so of the astronaut in the totally different atmosphere of the Earth. Similarly, the body may be merely a capsule designed for life in this world, required for life in this world. But in the totally different atmosphere of the next world, the body may not be required. Or to use another analogy, can the caterpillar conceive of what life is like as a butterfly? For the caterpillar, a cocoon may mean death, but for a butterfly it means a new beginning. And in a sense, this is Maimonides' view of the afterlife. We accept it as an article of faith, but we have no information on what kind of existence it might be. Since the afterlife represents a totally different atmosphere, a completely different dimension of existence than we experience here in this world, even if we knew what it were, we could not express it, since all of our language is predicated on our experience in this world, which is governed by time and space. Fourthly, from the Talmudic citation I quoted before about the questions will be asked in the afterlife, it is clear that the afterlife is viewed as a time of ultimate judgment, of ultimate reckoning. And this view expresses two important theological notions. First, that a person is held accountable for his or her actions, that the world is not a moral anarchy, that justice ultimately reigns. And this leads us to the second theological notion, which is that undoubtedly the most difficult question that theologians have to confront is the problem called Theodicy. Namely, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good things happen to bad people? The idea of the afterlife is a response to this problem. It is an assurance that justice does win out in the end, if not in this world, then in the next world. And fifthly, the idea of the afterlife in Judaism, as we see from the opening story about reincarnation, is a multifaceted idea. And now I would like to focus in on four views of the nature of the afterlife which we find in classical Jewish theological literature. First, view number one. Rabbinic literature and various liturgical texts describe the hereafter as an academy on high. In Hebrew, Yeshiva Shel Ma'alah. This description is significant for two reasons. The first reason is that anthropologists tell us that a people's idea of the afterlife represents that people's projection of its highest values. For example, for the Native Americans, the afterlife is a happy hunting ground. For the Vikings, it's Valhalla. For the Arab, it's an oasis. For the Jew, it's a house of study. That the afterlife is portrayed as a heavenly academy indicates that Judaism's highest value is study of the Torah. And once when I mentioned to my students that Jewish sources portray eternal life as being an eternal student, one of my students said, if heaven means being in school forever, I'd rather go the other place. The second reason why this is significant is because it articulates the notion that for Judaism, study is our pathway to eternity, our link with God. For example, a medieval Hebrew proverb says, "In prayer we speak to God, but in studying the Torah, God speaks to us." This is why, referring back to the Talmudic citation I mentioned before, the question, "Have you set aside time for study?" is one of the 4 questions asked at the time of judgment after death. This notion that study offers us a link to eternity is expressed in this little Hasidic story. It's told that a scholar goes to heaven to see what it's like there. But all he sees there are long benches with tables and chairs and scholars sitting and studying. Then he returns to this world and he conveys what he saw to his master. He asks his master, "Are the scholars in heaven?" The master replies, "No, heaven is in the scholars." So in this view, one does not go to heaven, rather one becomes heaven. Heaven is not a place, but rather a state of being. A second vision of the afterlife relates to the doctrine called in Hebrew Triatametim, or the resurrection of the dead. This idea historically developed at the time of the Maccabees and was later accepted and taught by the Pharisees. Maimonides and others considered the idea of resurrection of the dead to be one of a small number of the principles of the Jewish faith. Now, in the grace after meals, the Birchat HaMazon, we say, "May the All-Merciful merit us to experience the Messianic redemption in the world to come." What's the meaning of this? Since classical sources link the Messianic advent to the resurrection of the dead, this prayer recited after every meal clearly refers to the expectation of bodily resurrection. Indeed, the first text in Jewish sources that we have that makes the explicit connection between the problem of the good suffering in this world and the afterlife is from the well-known story of Hanukkah as told in the apocryphal book, the second book of the Maccabees. There we find the story of Hannah and her 7 sons who are tortured to death by the oppressor. And the mother in the story, Hannah, addressing the oppressor, says to him, "You wretch, you release us from this present life, but the King of the world, God, will raise us up because we have died for God's laws to an everlasting renewal of life." This is probably the first text in Jewish literature on resurrection of the body. But the Talmud later expands this notion to the idea of resurrection of the dead. To those who doubt that such a thing is possible, the Talmud says, if those who never lived before can be born and live, then why can't those who already lived live again? I'm going to repeat that. If those who never lived before can live, why can't those who already lived live again? Talmudic and medieval legal and theological sources took this notion of resurrection of the dead very literally and extremely seriously. For example, we find them raising questions like this. If a person is an amputee, will he be resurrected with or without his amputated limb? This problem led to the tradition of burying amputated limbs of the deceased in the same grave so they'll be available at the time of resurrection when the body will be resurrected and then restored to pristine health. A second question raised is this. If a person is a widow or a widower and then remarries, will this person be married to their first spouse, or their second spouse in the time of the resurrection? And I should also mention that Jewish law's opposition to cremation is also based upon the idea of the resurrection. Now, according to Maimonides, resurrection will occur at the time of the Messianic Advent. God will resurrect the dead, in his view, at that time, but not all the dead. For in Maimonides' view, only those who led moral lives will merit the resurrection in the Messianic era, and those who do not meet that standard are, in his view, doomed to oblivion. Those who did meet the standard of moral perfection, but who also achieved the higher accomplishment, in his view, of intellectual cohesion with God, don't require resurrection in the Messianic age for Maimonides, because they're already in the higher stage of a disembodied afterlife, which I'll talk about a little later. So for Maimonides, resurrection of the dead in the Messianic era gives the morally upright person a second chance, a second life, at attaining intellectual cohesion with God and spiritual permanence in the world to come. In his view, if a person attains this in the Messianic era, that's fine and good, but if not, the resurrected body lives out its normal life and then dies again, this time forever. As opposed to this, Nachmanides held the view that the resurrected body actually is a different kind of body than the first one and is made for more extended wear and lives forever. Now, Maimonides' detractors refused to accept his views on this for two reasons. The first reason was that it placed intellectual attainment over moral attainment. And secondly, it denied the morally upright eternal existence in the world to come. And in a minute, I'll have something more to say about Maimonides' idea of the disembodied afterlife. But let's not leave the idea of resurrection so fast, even though it has been largely rejected by modern Jewish thinkers. And it was specifically rejected already in 1885 by Reform Judaism in the document known as the Pittsburgh Platform, which states, and I quote, "We reject, as ideas not rooted in Judaism, the beliefs both in the bodily resurrection and in Gehinnom and Eden, hell and paradise, as abodes for everlasting punishment and reward." That's the quote from the Pittsburgh Platform. Instead of this, the platform maintains, and I quote, "We reassert that the doctrine of Judaism is that the soul is immortal." Now, this position of Reform Judaism at the end of the 19th century is very peculiar historically, because the idea of resurrection, historically, has been native to Judaism since the Pharisees, while the idea of immortality of the disembodied soul, discussed by Maimonides and others, is probably not native to Judaism, but seems to be a Greek import that was eventually absorbed by Jewish belief. Nonetheless, it is not the origin of a belief that determines its validity, but rather its subsequent acceptance and influence. Now, while the idea of resurrection does not seem to be very appealing in the modern period, I'm going to ask you to suspend judgment for a few minutes in order to consider 5 notions that the idea of resurrection articulates and see if it makes more sense than it does at first blush. First of all, the idea of resurrection of the individual articulates God's concern for the individual. Theologically speaking, this is the idea of individual providence. In other words, in this view, the human person is not lost in a crowd in the sight of God. In this view, each individual is precious to God in his or her own individual uniqueness and individuality. The continuous stress on Jewish community sometimes leads to a deflation of the significance of the individual. According to the Talmud, God started the human species with one person, namely Adam, to teach us the ultimate significance of each individual. In other words, resurrection admonishes us not to forget what God remembers, namely the preciousness of each person. Put another way, the doctrine of resurrection opposes the idea that the immortality of the Jewish people as a whole should overshadow the immortality of the individual Jew. Secondly, the idea of resurrection is an affirmation of the human body, because it's the body that is resurrected. For the Bible and for much of the Talmudic literature, the human being is a psychophysical composite, a union of body and soul. The identity of the individual is related not simply to the soul, but to the individual as a psychophysical organism. Judaism celebrates the body as a vehicle for the soul. Spirituality in Judaism is conveyed through the physical, through the body. For according to the Zohar, the body is the instrument through which the soul carries out its mission, which is to observe the commandments. Without the body, the soul would be a mute, vagabond spirit. Thirdly, resurrection conveys an idea of a life after death that takes place in this world. That is, it is a corporeal afterlife. And as an aside, one might mention that patients who have died and are brought back, in a way, achieve this status. And one can only project how this theological idea of resurrection of the body may be interpreted if and when the cloning of human beings is accomplished, where a whole person can be reborn from a single cell of his or her body. Fourthly, most Jewish thinkers link resurrection of the dead with the Messianic era, when the Jewish people will achieve total national liberation. Hence, resurrection of the dead celebrates not only Jewish individuality, but Jewish national destiny as well. And fifthly, there is a curious blessing recorded in the Talmud which has come into our daily morning liturgy that we recite every morning, and it reads like this: My God, the soul that you have placed in me is pure. You fashioned it. You it was who blew it into me. You it is who preserves it in me. And you it will be who will take it from me, only to return it to me in the time yet to be. Praised are you, God, who restores souls to lifeless bodies. This is said every morning. And according to this prayer, resurrection is not something that occurs only at the end of time with the Messianic era, but rather a kind of resurrection occurs each morning when the sleeping person awakens and the soul is restored. In other words, one need not wait until after death to experience resurrection. According to this prayer, it can happen every day. And in this regard, I'm sure you've used the expression, when you're tired, I'm dead, or I feel dead. And after a rest, you feel revived. Similarly, composers and writers and artists often admit to feeling like they're dead after completing a great work. But after a period of hibernation, they return to their creative work and feel revived. Or people go through traumas and tragedies or periods of life when they feel numb and deadened physically, emotionally, and spiritually. But if they're lucky, they discover that this is but a temporary death and is a prelude to a new life of new possibilities and experiences, to a resurrected existence. So it seems to me that only a person open to new possibilities, new opportunities, can find the idea of the afterlife appealing and promising, whereas a closed-off person who lives life in a state of suspended animation would not find such an idea engaging. Ironically, such a person is already dead in a way, and that is precisely the kind of person that requires a kind of resurrection even during life as opposed to afterlife. Maimonides' idea that resurrection may be a prelude to a disembodied afterlife leads us now to the third form of an afterlife in Jewish theology. Now, as I mentioned before, the idea of a disembodied afterlife probably came into Judaism under Greek philosophical influence. In Jewish thought, this idea took on a variety of often very complicated forms. I don't want to get into all of them here, but simply to consider two of them. One form is the idea that the soul and the body are natural enemies, that the soul, as Plato said, is a prisoner in the body. In this view, life is a struggle, it's a war, where the soul tries to subdue the body and to transcend the influences of the body. From this perspective, life is a trial, it's a test, to see how well we develop our soul despite the pernicious influence of the body, and this view often leads, as should be obvious, to asceticism, because asceticism is a means of subduing the instincts of the body in order to make manifest the soul and to prepare the soul for a disembodied existence in the world to come. Following this view, those individuals who fail the test, whose bodies triumph over their souls, only merit eternal oblivion. But for those whose souls triumph, there is in this view the eternal reward of the eternal repose of the soul in the spiritual realm that some call heaven or some call the world to come. And it would be a mistake to believe that this ascetic view, this view of the soul and body in constant war, is absent in Jewish sources. In fact, it's very much present in Jewish sources, particularly during the medieval period. A second version of the disembodied afterlife is the idea that the human soul is a composite of various parts or various faculties, some of which are essentially related to the body and some are not essentially related to the body. And for many of the medieval Jewish philosophers, Maimonides in particular, the one faculty of the soul not related to the body is what he calls the intellectual faculty of the soul. Now, all of these faculties of the soul work through the body to attain the goal of human existence, however it's defined. For example, as moral development, as communion with God, and so forth. And even the intellectual faculty works through a bodily organ, namely the brain, or what some philosophers call the mind. In other words, the brain is not intellectual in itself in this view, but becomes intellectual through the influence of the soul or the mind. And the brain, like all other organs of the body, can be a vehicle for the soul. If the entire soul successfully uses the organs of the body in attaining the goal of human existence, then the part of us that is most like God, for Maimonides, that's the intellect, or for others the spirit, or for others the divine spark implanted within us, then survives our bodily death, while the other parts, or the other faculties of the soul, perish with the body. Now, in this view, a person is his or her body, but even more, a person is his or her soul. In this view, the soul represents the very essence of the person. The soul represents some spiritual quality that we share with God. And according to some of the Jewish mystics, the soul may even be, as they put it, a part of God. In Hebrew, chelek Eloha mimal. From this perspective, one can become who one is by becoming more than one is. In this view, the divine mandate is for each person to develop the part of us that is most like God, whether it be the creative part, the spiritual part, the intellectual part. Putting this into modern parlance, even if a person does not admit the existence of the soul, nevertheless, a person can perpetuate him or herself by using the body as a vehicle to create great works of art, literature, music, thought, or sacred deeds that can survive our bodily death. It is this desire to perpetuate ourselves, which is an innate human trait, that leads us to the idea of life after death. Now, I want to make three very short additional points on the idea of the survival of the soul. The first one is that in English, unlike many other languages, we usually use the term my body rather than myself when referring to the body. The question then is, who is the my that possesses the body, if not our essence, or what some call our soul? Secondly, the existence of the soul can neither be proven nor disproven by science. Indeed, being a metaphysical entity by definition, the soul transcends scientific explanation or description. And third, I think we should remember what each bar mitzvah boy or girl learns when they're preparing for that event, namely the second blessing over the Torah that says, Chaye olam nata b'tochenu. God has implanted within us eternal life. All the bar mitzvah boys and girls learn this, but how many know what it means? It means that God has placed within us something eternal that some call the soul. And through the development of that something, we can become more than we are. We can realize our own true selves with the soul, which is the essence of what we are. It is our own true self. The afterlife, in this view, consists of committing oneself to what is lasting within each of us. The idea of the afterlife is a doctrine that teaches that life is ultimately serious, that life is not a game of trivial pursuit. In other words, the afterlife poses a poignant question to each of us, and that question is, as William James said, what of ourselves do we desire to perpetuate after our death? Now moving to the fourth form of the afterlife that we find in classical Jewish sources, beginning in the Middle Ages, is the idea known as Transmigration of Souls. This notion is related to the problem of Theodicy, evil, divine justice. This doctrine of Transmigration of Souls claims that a person deserves more than one crack at life, because some people are born deprived, while other people are born advantaged. And to expect the same achievement of both during a lifetime would be unfair. Therefore, in this view, a person gets more than a single opportunity at a life in order to develop one's spiritual potential. The idea of Transmigration of Souls teaches that a soul can live in a variety of bodies through a variety of lifetimes in order to have the opportunity of realizing its potential. And furthermore, according to many teachings, what kind of body one is assigned in each life reflects the moral quality of one's former lifetime. And when the soul is developed as high as it is supposed to be developed, it can then break out of the wheel of transmigration and find eternal repose with God. But, according to some traditions, not even always then. Because the righteous, precisely because they are righteous, are concerned about the souls of their fellow human beings, and they may therefore, in the language of the mystics, impregnate the body of an evil person with their own soul in order to elevate that evil person's soul to a higher spiritual realm. And there is, of course, great danger in this, and that is that the righteous soul may accomplish its mission, or it may be dragged down by the evil soul and then have to go through the process of transmigration once again. Now, the popular legend of the Dibuk, which many of you know, assumes this idea of transmigration of souls. What the Dibuk really is an unrecycled soul. It's a soul that has left the body of a person who has died, but has not yet been assigned a new body. So the Dibuk invades another's body, usually to accomplish some deed necessary for it to be able to be finally assigned a new host body. Now, as we saw in the opening story, reincarnation is also taught by the Jewish mystics. In this view, for a variety of cardinal sins, a person can be reincarnated in a variety of animals or even in plants and stones. The worse the sin, the lower the life form the person is assigned. And in this view, there is always hope, because using the animal or the plant into which the person has been transmigrated for sacred purposes helps the soul within it to be liberated from this lower bodily life form, and then the opportunity to go up the scale to a higher life form. And it may surprise some of you to know, if you're a vegetarian, may offend you to know, that Jewish mystics justified the eating of meat by maintaining that if we eat meat from a certain animal, and then we use the energy we get from that meat for study or prayer or the performance of other sacred deeds, we can thereby liberate the soul entrapped within that animal body, allowing it to ascend to a higher form of being. And even in Kabbalistic literature, we find lists or charts of what sins cause one to be transmigrated into which animals. We find directories, like telephone books, of which great rabbis were the transmigration of which biblical and earlier rabbinic figures. We are told of mystics with the powers to read the lines on the foreheads and the hands of people to determine the state of their souls in this life and in past lives as well. For example, it is told that the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, once met a very arrogant man. And the Baal Shem Tov said to him, "Don't be so arrogant, because in reading the lines on your forehead, I see that in your next life you are going to come back as a mouse." Some of the Jewish mystics dealt with the problem of maintaining human identity through the process of transmigration by positing the existence of an astral body, which is unaffected by various transmigrations an individual undergoes, and which thereby maintains the integrity of individual identity. And here too, as in the idea of resurrection, great emphasis is put upon human individuality both in this world and in the next world. For one of the notions of immortality we find in the Bible is that of biological perpetuation through one's children and through one's descendants. And it seems to me that this is the idea behind the biblically ordained practice called in Hebrew yibum, which means the obligation of the brother of a deceased to marry his widowed sister-in-law, lest the biological line of the deceased brother come to an end. Now, the Kabbalists, the Jewish mystics, linked this idea of biological perpetuation to the idea of transmigration. And some of the Kabbalists even taught that the soul of the deceased brother is transmigrated into the body of the child born from the union between his brother and his wife. In this way, the deceased is perpetuated both in his body and in his soul, and in a sense, a person can become their own father. Now, in my view, even if one does not accept the idea of transmigration of souls, there are at least 4 ideas that this teaching about transmigration of souls suggests that are compelling to us today. First of all, we are who we were. In other words, transmigration teaches that no person is a blank slate. No person is a creation out of nothing. Rather, each person carries a history, and that history helps shape his or her destiny and his or her identity. Second, as Yogi Berra said, it's not over till it's over. In other words, there are always new possibilities, new opportunities. The unfulfilled life, the disadvantaged life, still has a chance. The idea that one can become one's own father means that one can always recreate one's own life. Thirdly, we can reinterpret the idea of transmigration as meaning that in a single life, a person can be many people. And I'm not talking here about multiple personalities, but multiple possibilities, multiple careers, lifestyles within a single life. The door to change and improvement, as well as to change and decline, are always open. What we choose and what we do determines the life or the lives that we live during our time on earth. And fourthly, the idea of transmigration and reincarnation points to an important religious insight, which is that each person is more than he or she thinks he or she is, that our lives are much richer and deeper than we dare to imagine, that our lives reflect a fractional inkling of what is really potentially within each of us. And in this regard, it is told that a skeptic once came to the Rabbi of Kutsk to mock him. The skeptic facetiously asked the rabbi, "It has been said that you can perform miracles." "I can," said the rabbi. "Then show me one," said the skeptic. "Show me how you can resurrect the dead." The Rabbi of Kutsk said, "It's harder to resurrect the living, and I'd rather show you that." Now, before closing discussion, there are three issues that bear at least some brief mention. The first of the three is this: when we tell someone to go to hell, what do we mean, theologically speaking? The usual Hebrew word for hell is Gehinnom. For the Talmud, this word refers not to hell, but actually to purgatory, namely to the place where judgment is meted out for one's transgressions, so that afterwards one can receive one's rewards either in resurrection or in the eternal spiritual repose of the soul, or both, depending upon which sources one consults. Now, the Talmud states that the worst of sinners spends a year in purgatory, and this is why we recite the Kaddish for 11 months, because the assumption is that the person we mourn was not the worst of sinners, so we don't expect they'll be there for a whole year, but to be on the safe side, since there may be some things about them we didn't know, we say Kaddish for the full 11 months. For Maimonides, Gehinnom is hell, by which Maimonides means the complete annihilation of the soul. For Nachmanides, Gehinnom is a place on earth. For others, it's a place where the person is physically tortured for his sins. And this is a little strange, because the idea of the physical torture of a soul is a little ludicrous. But I would say that Jewish moralists who talked about the physical torture of a soul in the world to come simply used it as a means of scaring people into repenting of their sins and leading a moral life, not unlike the way that many contemporary commercials try to scare us into eating cholesterol-free and high-fiber foods by describing the torments in store for us if we don't listen to them. Now, according to Hasidic tradition, which makes very little use of the term Gehinnom or hell, hell is simply a matter of perspective. In other words, when the righteous arrive in paradise, in the afterlife, they perceive themselves to be in heaven because there they find a continuation of the spiritual life of study and prayer and moral virtue that they practiced while they were alive in this world. However, when the wicked arrive in paradise, not having cultivated the moral virtues and the spiritual life while alive, they perceive it as a hell. So in this view, heaven and hell are not places, but they're simply matters of perspective. And it's like the joke about the man who meets his old friend in the afterlife, and he sees his elderly friend sitting in a chair with a beautiful and voluptuous young woman on his lap. So the man says to his friend, "So this is the afterlife? This is heaven? Is it heaven or is it hell?" And his friend who's sitting in the chair says, "It's both. For me, it's heaven. For her, it's hell." The second point is that arriving at a precise definition of death is a huge problem for contemporary medical science. Medical science increasingly now tends to view death as a process rather than as an event. And this view is shared by some Jewish traditions which see the process of death extending even after death. In some Jewish sources, the trauma for the soul of its separation from the body is so great that this trauma occurs in a number of stages, because the soul has to get used to the reality of its separation from the body and from its earthly domain. Now, this idea is expressed, for example, in some of the customs relating to Jewish mourning. For example, the custom of having the candle burning in the home during the week of mourning, the Shiva, and the covering of the mirrors in the house of Shiva. The candle signifies that the soul is still abiding in its customary dwelling in the house, haunting it, so to speak. And since a dead person does not cast a reflection in the mirror, which if you don't know it from anywhere, you know it from the Dracula movies, we cover the mirrors in a house of mourning, because if the deceased person looked in the mirror and realized that it were detached from the body, namely that it was dead, that person would suffer unnecessary pain and trauma and have difficulty in undergoing the process of adjusting to the separation of the soul and the body, namely to the fact that he or she is dead. Thirdly, according to Maimonides, heaven and hell and hell are not places where you go. They're rather states of the soul. In this sense, the afterlife is not a place, but it's rather a state of being. A state of being which is beyond time and space, beyond the dimensions of this world. Consequently, Maimonides teaches that for human beings to try to grasp the nature of the afterlife, to figure out what it is, would be like a person who was born blind trying to describe color to another person. Thus, the afterlife is a belief that is part and parcel of Jewish faith, and it must be accepted or disregarded as an act of faith. For about the nature of the afterlife, we have speculation, but we have no experience. And even if we had experience, that experience would be outside the ken of our understanding, since it would be experience in a totally different dimension of existence which we could not even describe. Nonetheless, tradition assures us that in this life it is possible to experience a foretaste of the life to come. For a Talmudic text, and I conclude with this quote from the Tractate Brachot, says, "There are three things that can give us a foretaste of the world to come, and those are the Sabbath, a sunny day, and sexual intercourse." Whether this text is true or not, that I leave for each of you to determine. Thank you.